95%. That's how dependent American agriculture is on imported potash, the one fertilizer component that makes modern farming possible, the nutrient that keeps crops alive, the substance American farmers cannot do without. And 79% of that imported potash comes from one country, Canada. A lot of it does come in from Canada, and so we will end up putting very severe tariffs on that if we have to, because that is the way you want to bolster here. You put very severe tariffs on, you will be making your own fertilizer very soon. That was Donald Trump at a White House roundtable just days ago, announcing his plan to solve American agriculture's fertilizer crisis. Tariff Canadian potash, force domestic production, make America self-sufficient. Within hours, American farmers were panicking. Agriculture industry groups were issuing urgent warnings, and Canadian potash producers were quietly calling alternative buyers in Europe and Asia to discuss redirecting supply. But here's what Trump doesn't understand, or refuses to acknowledge. American agriculture is structurally, fundamentally, existentially dependent on Canadian potash. There is no substitute, there is no alternative, there is no timeline under which America becomes self-sufficient in potash production, and Trump just threatened to cut off the supply. Let's start with a fundamental truth that should terrify every American who eats food. The United States produces only about 400,000 tons of potash domestically. That covers roughly 7% of annual demand. The other 93% must be imported. American farmers use approximately 5.3 million tons of potash annually. They spread it on cornfields in Iowa, wheat fields in Kansas, potato farms in Idaho. It's essential for moisture retention, disease prevention, and maximizing crop yields. Potash is one of 3 critical nutrients every plant needs to survive: nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium, which comes from potash. Without all 3, crops fail, yields collapse, food production stops. There is no substitute, there is no alternative. You either have potash or your crops die. And where does that imported potash come from? 79% comes from Canada, specifically from Saskatchewan, which sits atop the largest high-quality potash deposits in the world and produces about 1/3 of global supply. The numbers aren't even close. Canada has 1.1 billion tons of potash reserves. The United States has 220 million tons. Canada produced 21.9 million tons in 2023. America produced 400,000 tons. American agriculture depends on Canadian potash the way humans depend on oxygen. And Trump just threatened to cut off the supply with very severe tariffs. This isn't the first time Trump has threatened potash. Earlier this year, when he announced blanket 25% tariffs on all Canadian goods, he initially included fertilizer. The response from American agriculture was immediate and desperate. Between early January and late February, the price of potash jumped from $330 per short ton to $348. American farmers preparing to plant their spring crops watched input costs spiral. Republican lawmakers from farming states flooded the White House with calls. Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins personally intervened to beg Trump to reconsider. Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, a Republican, publicly pressured Trump to exempt fertilizer from tariffs. The American Soybean Association warned that farmers were facing their 3rd consecutive year of losses. Trump eventually backed down, sort of. He reduced the tariff on fertilizer from 25% to 10%, claiming it was a reasonable compromise. Even that 10% tariff increased costs for farmers who were already struggling. Now, just months later, Trump is threatening to go even further. Not 10%, not 25%. Very severe tariffs. His exact words, which in Trump speak could mean anything from 50% to 200%. And this time, he's not threatening because of a specific trade dispute or negotiating leverage. He's threatening because he thinks tariffs will somehow force America to produce its own potash and become self-sufficient. It's economic delusion on a scale that would be comical if it weren't about to devastate American agriculture. Trump's stated goal is to use tariffs to bolster domestic fertilizer production. The logic, if you can call it that, is simple. Make imported fertilizer expensive enough, and American companies will start mining and producing their own. Here's why that will never happen. First, potash mining depends on naturally occurring deposits. You cannot create potash. You cannot manufacture it in a lab. You can only extract it from underground deposits that took millions of years to form. And the United States simply does not have sufficient high-quality deposits to meet domestic demand. Saskatchewan has massive, easily accessible potash deposits that make extraction relatively cheap and efficient. American deposits are smaller, lower quality, and more expensive to access. That's not a policy failure, that's geology. Second, building new potash mines takes 10 to 15 years. You need to identify suitable deposits, secure environmental permits, construct massive underground mining operations, build processing facilities, and develop transportation infrastructure. The timeline is measured in decades, not months. Even if American companies decided tomorrow to invest billions in new potash mines, those mines wouldn't be operational until the late 2030s. What are American farmers supposed to do in the meantime? Not plant crops. Third, the economics don't work. Canadian potash is cheaper to produce because of better geology and established infrastructure. Even with tariffs, it's not clear that American producers could compete on price. And if American-produced potash ends up being more expensive than imported potash, even after tariffs, Trump will have accomplished nothing except raising costs for farmers. When Trump threatens Canadian potash, the implicit assumption is that American farmers have alternatives. They don't. There are only 3 major potash exporters in the world: Canada, Russia, and Belarus. Those 3 countries control the vast majority of global potash production and export capacity. So if Trump tariffs Canadian potash, where are American farmers supposed to get their supply? Russia, the country America is sanctioning over Ukraine, the strategic adversary that American policy has spent decades trying to contain. Belarus, the dictatorship run by Alexander Lukashenko that is essentially a Russian puppet state. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe made this point explicitly. They would have to buy it somewhere else, namely Russia would be the option. I think most Americans would agree that we would much rather get our potash from our friends in Canada than from Russia and Belarus. But Trump doesn't care about geopolitics when he's focused on tariffs. So American farmers face a nightmare scenario. Either pay dramatically higher prices for Canadian potash, or start buying from authoritarian regimes that use energy exports as geopolitical weapons. And here's the kicker. Russia and Belarus produce about 37% of the world's potash combined. If American demand suddenly shifts to Russian suppliers, guess what happens to global prices? They spike, because Russia and Belarus would have newfound leverage over a desperate buyer. Congratulations, Trump. You just handed Putin control over American food production. While Trump is threatening tariffs, Canadian potash producers aren't sitting around waiting to see what happens. They're actively preparing for the possibility that American markets become unprofitable or inaccessible. Saskatchewan produces about 1/3 of the world's potash supply. About half of that production goes to the United States. But Canadian producers have been building relationships with alternative buyers for months, ever since Trump started his tariff threats earlier this year. Europe is hungry for potash. Asian markets are growing. Latin American agriculture is expanding. All of these regions need potash, and all of them would happily buy from Canadian suppliers if American demand drops. Nutrien, one of Canada's largest potash producers, recently announced plans to build a new $1 billion export facility. The interesting part, they're building it in Washington State, not British Columbia. That facility will allow Canadian potash to reach Asian markets more efficiently, reducing dependence on American buyers. The Saskatchewan Mining Association has been clear about their strategy. If American tariffs make the United States market unprofitable, Canadian producers will redirect supply to other global markets. They have the capacity, they have the relationships, they just need a reason to shift. Trump is about to give them that reason. At the same White House event where Trump threatened potash tariffs, he also announced a $12 billion aid package for American farmers. $11 billion will go to row crop farmers by the end of February. The remaining $1 billion will be held back for fruits, vegetables, and other crops. This isn't the first time Trump has paid farmers to absorb the costs of his trade policies. During his first term, Trump gave about $23 billion in aid to farmers hurt by his tariff wars. Farmers are set to receive a near-record $40 billion in government payments this year. And here's the projection that should terrify everyone. Net farm income could fall by more than $30 billion in 2026 due to a decline in government payments and low crop prices. According to estimates from the Food and Agricultural Policy Research Institute at the University of Missouri. Do you see the trap Trump has created? His tariffs raise costs for farmers. He then gives them subsidies to absorb those costs. But the subsidies aren't permanent. They're temporary political band-aids that don't address the underlying problem. American farmers cannot compete globally when their input costs are artificially inflated by tariffs. Worse, fertilizer accounts for more than 35% of operating costs for corn and wheat producers. That's the single largest input expense. So when Trump tariffs potash, he's hitting farmers in their most vulnerable spot. The potash debacle exposes something fundamental about Trump's approach to trade. He doesn't understand supply chains. He doesn't understand commodity markets. And he doesn't understand the difference between negotiating leverage and mutual dependence. Trump looks at trade the way he looked at real estate deals in New York. You have something I want, I have something you want, I apply pressure, you fold, I win. But commodities don't work that way. When you depend on a supplier for 95% of a critical input that you cannot produce domestically, you don't have leverage. The supplier does, especially when that supplier has alternative customers lined up and ready to buy. Canada doesn't need to sell potash to America. They would prefer to because the logistics are easier and the relationship has been stable for decades. But they don't need to. Europe will buy it. Asia will buy it. Latin America will buy it. America, on the other hand, absolutely needs Canadian potash. There is no domestic alternative. There are no friendly alternative suppliers. There is no timeline under which America becomes self-sufficient in potash production. So when Trump threatens severe tariffs on potash, he's not demonstrating strength. He's demonstrating that he doesn't understand the market he's trying to manipulate. Here's what will happen if Trump follows through on severe potash tariffs. Canadian potash prices in America will spike. Farmers preparing to plant spring crops will face impossible choices. Pay dramatically higher prices for fertilizer, reduce fertilizer use and accept lower yields, or switch to Russian suppliers and face political backlash. Some farmers will absorb the higher costs and pass them to consumers as higher food prices. Some will reduce production, leading to food shortages and even higher prices. Some will go out of business entirely. Canadian potash producers will redirect supply to international markets. The relationships they build with European, Asian and Latin American buyers will not dissolve if Trump eventually removes the tariffs. Those markets will remain open, and Canadian producers will have less reason to prioritize American demand. Meanwhile, Russian and Belarusian potash producers will gain market share in America. Putin will gain leverage over American food production, and the United States will have traded dependence on a democratic ally for dependence on an authoritarian adversary, all because Trump thinks tariffs are the solution to every problem, regardless of whether the underlying economics support that approach. American farmers are learning a brutal lesson. When your president treats trade as a zero-sum game and allies as adversaries, you pay the price. They voted for Trump believing he would protect their interests. Instead, he has launched trade wars that close their export markets, imposed tariffs that raise their input costs, and now threatens to cut off their access to the single most critical agricultural input they cannot produce domestically. The subsidies Trump offers don't fix the problem. They temporarily mask the pain while the underlying damage accumulates. And every farmer knows that subsidies are political. They depend on congressional appropriations and presidential priorities. They can disappear the moment political winds shift. What farmers need is stable, affordable access to inputs and reliable access to export markets. Trump has destroyed both, and his latest potash threat will make an already dire situation catastrophic. The farmers Trump claimed to be helping are about to learn that in his trade war, they were never the priority. They were always just collateral damage. Trump threatened very severe tariffs on Canadian potash, thinking it would force America to become self-sufficient in fertilizer production. Instead, he's about to cut off American farmers from a supply they cannot replace, drive up food prices for American consumers, and hand Putin leverage over United States agriculture. The farmers he claimed to protect will pay the price for an economic delusion that defies geology, mathematics, and basic common sense. And Canada will simply take their potash elsewhere, to buyers who actually understand the value of what they're purchasing.